So security is plays a very important role when we are talking about Azure, right, and or any cloud environment. And in this case, we'll be talking about Key Vault and Manage Identities. Okay, so we'll be learning about the following concepts: what are Manage Identities, what are the Key Vaults. Okay, so authentication with the Manage Identities. There are two type of identities when you are talking about. One is system identity, another is known as user defined identity. So these are the two kind of identities, and you get a lot of questions also on security around this identity management. What is system assigned managed identity? What is user assigned managed identity? Right. So first of all, what is a managed identity? It combines the authentication and RBAC and eliminates the need of credentials of the certificates. Okay, so that means where you need not to enter the credentials or the certificates to access any resource. Rather, we provide some kind of authentication mechanism where you can access your resources through some RBAC or some resource-based access control. Okay, so that means to eliminate the need of credentials, because whenever we need to enter the username password, there are chances to get that password hacked. But what is the other way where we can avoid that entering the credentials and we can make use of some other alternative? Let's take the example of GitHub. What are the various ways to push your code to GitHub? One is, if I go back to my GitHub, this is my GitHub. I'm just opening it in another. Let's say this is my repository. Okay, and one way to log into your GitHub is or pushing it HTTPS protocol. Another way is using the SSH protocol. SSH protocol means where I need not to enter the credentials. It will bypass your credentials and you are going to use the public and private keys, right? So here if you go to your settings, and here you will find SSH keys. So if you store some kind of keys, generate the keys and store it here, and then log into Git through SSH protocol rather than HTTP protocol. So this is a one kind of token. Okay, so through this token you are able to access your GitHub. The other way is username password. Okay, but to avoid that, you can create these keys, and through this key you can directly log into this GitHub. So this key is a kind of token which help you to avoid that entering the username and credentials, and this key can be changed anytime, and this is very difficult to be hacked as compared to the username passwords. That is what it is talking about here. If we are using some kind of managed identity, just like in the case of some authentication mechanism, and which eliminate the need of credentials or the certificates, which is more secure. Okay, and that's what we are talking about, that we will create some kind of mechanism to handle the authentication. And now it's saying that the concept of managed identity involves the use of client ID, object ID, and instance metadata. And there are two types of identities, as I told you: system identity and the user identity. What is the meaning of system identity and what is the user identity? First, let's understand that. Then we'll go to that how to create it. Okay, so let me see if it is there. Now let me go back to the documentation. Azure managed identity. Okay, and let's go to the documentation. Here is the basics of the Azure identity. So it's saying that managed identities of two types. And first of all, let's understand the benefits of managed identity. You get some questions around this. Okay, the benefits are you do not need to manage the credentials. I have shown you in case of Git, you need not to manage credentials. Credentials are not even accessible to you. You can use the manage identities to authenticate to your resources. And manage identities can be used without any additional cost. It doesn't occur any additional cost. You can directly use it. You need not to pay additional for that, but they are more secure. That's the advantage. And manage identities for Azure is the new name of service, formerly known as managed service identity. Earlier it was known as managed service identity. Now it is being referred at as managed identity. So I'm pasting this URL for your reference. Okay. Now there are two types of identities. You get some questions around this. System assigned. When we say system assigned identity, which is related to a particular system or a service. Whenever you create a system or a service, for example, you create a virtual machine and you assign a system assigned identity in that particular virtual machine. That means as long as that particular virtual machine will exist, your system identity will work. And the moment you delete your resource or your virtual machine, your managed identity will be deleted. Okay, how to create a managed identity for a virtual machine? For example, let me show you. So if I go to my virtual machines and I say create a virtual machine, I create a virtual machine and say I select some, say this one, and my test VM, and if I next, before that I have to give the credentials. Let me give the credentials, username, password, Azure user, and the passwords. Password is okay. I've given the password. Now after that, if I go to the management part, here we assign the identities. Under management, there is an option identity, system assigned managed identity. If you bring your cursor here, it will give you the detailed description about this. Read it. A system assigned managed identity enable Azure resources to authenticate to the cloud services without storing the credentials in the code. Once enabled, all the necessary permissions can be granted via the Azure role-based access control. Okay, the life cycle of this type of managed identity is tied to the life cycle of the resource, and this line is important. What is the life cycle of the system managed identity? The life cycle of this type of managed identity is tied to the life cycle of the resource. So that means as long as the resource exists, your system identity exists. When you delete your resource, that managed identity will be also be deleted. So additionally, each resource like virtual machine can only have one system managed identity. That's another question which for your certification. How many system assigned managed identities you can create per resource? You can create only one system assigned managed entity per resource. Here is the complete documentation. When you click on it, you will be redirected to the same URL which I'm showing to you right now. Same URL. Okay. So this is about your system identity. So to create the system identity, you have to select this checkbox. When you select this checkbox, that means your system identity will be enabled. Okay, and then when you go review and create, so now you enable your system identity. So this is how, while creating your virtual machine under management, you have to select that option to assign the system identity. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead. And then it is talking about what is user assigned identity. User assigned identity is associated with a particular user, irrespective of the kind of resources you are creating. For example, I have assigned you a manager identity. If I have assigned you a manager identity, that means you can use it for any resource. You can use it on your VM, you can use it on your web app. It's a user-based identity. As long as your ID is valid, you can access any resource. And once your ID is deleted, your manager identity will be deleted. So user assigned identity is based upon per user. No one else can access it. That is known as user assigned identity. And system assigned identity is based upon the resource type. If I have assigned a resource, an identity only for the virtual machine, as long as that particular virtual machine is exists, you can only access that virtual machine uh, till the time it is alive. Once it is terminated, you cannot access that manager entity. So this is these are the two type of manager entities. Okay, here are few differences, and you will definitely get at least 2 or 3 questions around it. I'm pasting in the chat window. Right, so when you create it, we have to select the resource, for example, virtual machine or app service, create as part of the Azure resource. As I've shown you, I just created this virtual machine, and how can I verify? I need to go to the identity part, and now you can see the status of system assigned identities on, because while creating it I have selected that checkbox. If later on I want to switch it off, I can make it off and save it. It will switch off the manage identity, and you can associate it with the particular roles. If you want to enable user identity, you have to click on this and configure it here. Okay, you have to add the usernames to which you want to provide the access. So these are the two type of identities which is available under the say in VM, under settings, under identity. You can enable and disable it. Clear? And here it says that system management is restricted to one per resource and is tied to the life cycle of the resource. You can grant permissions to manage entry by using the RBAC. So using RBAC, you can grant the permissions. Now it's here the permissions. Now what kind of permission you want to give? Now you can select it, whether you want to give it a contributor role or whether you want to select what kind of access. Okay, so that you can provide. Okay, so the next is life cycle. You can understand by we discussed that as long as the resource is alive, your manager entry will work. And what is the life cycle of a user assigned identity? Independent life cycle must be explicitly deleted. This is also a very important question. The life cycle of a system assigned identity is as long as your resource is available. If you delete your resource, say VM, your manager entry is gone. That is pretty obvious. This manager entry is associated to this VM with its virtual machine. If virtual machine itself is deleted, then what is the significance of its manager identity, right? So this identity is associated with your VM. If I delete this VM, this manage identity, system manager identity will also be deleted. That is the life cycle. The life cycle of user assigned is independent of life cycle because it's associated to the user. Even if you keep deleting your resources and create a new resource, doesn't matter as long as that user is having a valid ID. Sharing across Azure resources, it cannot be shared and it can be shared. This is another question that can be asked. Is system assigned identity shareable across resources? No. How you can share it across resources? Because it is created for one particular resource. If I created this identity only for my VMs, how can I share it with the web app or any other resource? I can't do that because it's a system assigned. In case of users, it is shareable among different resources because you have granted that user. For example, you have the key of your you are having a key of a particular house. If you unlock the key, the complete house is accessible. You can go in any room. But if you have key of particular room, then you can only access that particular room. So this is similar to that. If you have a key of particular system or a particular area, you are accessible to that area only. Here, if a user is given a key, a user can access that particular complete resource as long as he is having that key. Okay, so this can be shared across resources, and same manager entity can be associated with more than one resource. This cannot be associated with more than one resource. It can be associated with the more than one resource. What are the common use cases for this kind of identity? Workloads that are contained within a single resource. So if you are dealing with a single resource, you can make use of it, right? For example, an application that run on a single virtual machine. So you are working on a single virtual machine, you can go with that. But the workloads are using multiple resources, then they can share a single identity. In that case, go with the user identity. Okay, so if there are multiple shareable resources, go with this kind of identity. If there is a single resource, you can go with the system identity. So how can I use manage identities for Azure resources? I can use manage identities when as a developer I want to build an application using. So I can make use of manage identities with all these kind of resources. Azure VMs, app service, function, container, Kubernetes service, logic app, storage, and with that kind of targets. Any target that supports your Azure Active Directory authentication, your application service, Azure Key Vault, storage, without having to manage the credentials. If your application that can access these kind of resources, say Azure Key Vault, storage, SQL, then you can make use of your manager entries without having to manage the credentials. So this was all about the basics of manager entity.